I don't think that this course would be complete without a brief discussion about using covariates or control variables responsibly in our work. Using covariates in a wise way has been talked about in a couple of pieces. I think it's important for us to know they exist, at least for reference. The first one here is Spector and Brannick, and that is an older piece, and it's very conceptual. They gave a few examples, so hopefully you saw the questions that accompany this article online. And then the second piece is the Burneth and Guinness one, where they do an extensive study of how control variables have been used in the field of IO research and our big journals. And then they provide some best practices that I will go over. So I'm going to go over the highlights of both of these articles. I think it's important to just go over broadly why covariates are used in research. I think, unfortunately, from a practical perspective, people are under such pressure to publish, and my graduate school lab was no exception to this, that control variables will use very unwisely, unintentionally, with little intent behind it and rationale, because it was all about being able to show your focal variables, whatever they were, if you were testing a moderation or just a straight correlation between one variable and another, to make sure that that was significant, that went below the p 0.05 threshold. That if it was below that, then it was good, and if not, add a couple covariates and see if it is significant at that point. And the reason that we can add covariance and increases the chance of any given variable in the equation becoming significant is especially when the covariates are less correlated with each other and we have low multicollinearity. Remember this idea that each additional variable in the model soaks up some of that unexplained variability, and then the overlap between the focal variable and the DV stays the same. And when you cut into the unexplained variability with other things, then it's more likely to be significant. And so researchers know this, and they try desperately to get their focal variables to significance. I think in both pieces, the authors would agree that that is not a legit way to use covariates. Now, we could go on bemoaning the problems with the system and the way researchers are pressured, and we can say, well, they shouldn't be doing this, but the system encourages and incentivizes this. And that's beyond the scope of this discussion, although we know that exists, and there's that whole thing that we've talked about before. But the authors are saying this is not the best way to get good inferences about the interrelationships among variables and all of these different things that we care about when we give guidance to practitioners who are implementing programs and interventions, initiatives for real people. And that's what we always have to keep in mind, is that when we publish in journals, we need to make sure that when people use our work, that it's reliable, it's as trustworthy as it can be. And so this use of control variables is not the best way to get there. So there is an example in Spector and Brannick specifically. Let's talk about the first thing that they mention. One of the first things is this purifying of relationships. And so this example is adapted from theirs. We have the nuisance variable, or the covariate, and that is the subordinate's liking of their leader. So I'm trying to make a realistic example so it's easy to understand. We often have in IO, subordinates rate their leaders. And there are problems with that approach that we can't go into now, but subordinates do these ratings, and we have different dimensions of leader performance, and two of these that have been shown to really drive leadership effectiveness is the quality of their decision making as leaders. Are they making the right decisions with the information they have? Are they communicating those decisions? And there's various aspects of this, but let's just call it decision making. And then there's this other dimension called sense making, and this is the extent to which the leader brings the subordinates in on the bigger system. So if we make a choice as our team, how does that impact the larger organization ecosystem and even beyond? What is our place? What are some options we have versus options we don't have now? And so it's this whole idea of the extent to which the leader helps the subordinates to make sense of their environment, to understand what options are on the table versus not, understand the culture and the unintended things that are going on, the unintentional, the under the surface, things in the culture that we don't often talk about, but they're implied. All of these things, letting the subordinates in on what's really happening so that together we can strategize within the constraints that we are under. Can we still move the ball down the field and meet our goals? That's the idea. So the subordinates rate, and we want to know the extent to which these are really correlated with one another. And when they're correlated with one another, because the rater, whoever that is, the subordinate in this case, likes the leader a lot. They have a personal liking for that leader. They get along with them well. There's all these, it's like a bias, right? It's a bias that causes us to rate both of these dimensions highly, or if we don't like the person, to rate them both poorly. And part of that is artificial. It's an upward estimate of the correlation, the size of the correlation. Whereas if we partialed this out, we would see a more realistic picture, right? Because this is a nuisance variable, it needs to be dealt with. It's contaminating, quote unquote, this relationship. So the way that we purify this correlation to see if sense making predicts decision making, and let's just do it that way. There are only two variables, so let's assume this is the DV, the decision making, and this is the IV. And so when we partial this out, treat it as a control, that is. So I'm going to take the transparency down to 0. And this is what happens when we partial it out. Remember, this is like the Cookie Monster. Back a few weeks ago, we talked about the partial, how the bite is taken out of both variables. We partial that covariate out of both the IV and the DV, such that this is the unique variability explained right here. Specifically, sense-making predicts decision-making this much, and then we have it over this amount. And that's more likely to be significant, of course, than if we didn't partial this out, right? Because, and we'd have an overestimate of that. So I'm not sure if it would be actually more difficult to find significance. It would be if we did the semi-partial, right? Because semi-partial is this unique part over the entire variability, total variability. But anyway, this is the way that people have typically treated variables, quote unquote, that contaminate the relationship. And so, unfortunately, that leaves just this much. But Spector and Brannick say, what if this is not a nuisance variable? And this is all in your model specification process, right? Your theory. What if liking is actually a relevant variable, such that when the leader is performing well, you like them more? So this is like the DV. So when this is treated as the DV, let's go back here. And when this is treated as the DV, that these good things that the leader does actually increase people's liking, then the correlation between these two, we would just say, is this much, right? This is the variability that we care about right here, because this is no longer a nuisance variable that we're partialing out and taking away. So what they're saying, that's what they mean when they say that, quote, throw the baby out with the bathwater, is that really, if you think this is a nuisance variable and it's not, it's actually an effect of these two things, then you will estimate it to be this much out of this much total, this much here, instead of estimating it to be this much out of this much here. And so what you're doing is getting a much smaller amount than it would be otherwise. And so they said it's important to think about theory, because your theory will dictate what you think is worth partialing out and what isn't. So if liking is just an effect, then probably you just leave it out of the equation altogether and just run a correlation, and then this is the overlap right here, these two parts. I'll just draw it for you here. This section, this section right here is the part that you care about, is that overlap. Now, if you think this is a nuisance variable, once again, you're going to have just this tiny part out of this as the whole, as the proportion. So it matters. All that to say your theory matters. Now, they also allude to a piece by Meehl in 1971. And this is a long time ago, but Paul Meehl was a great person. He did this work on clinical judgment that is, I think, hard for all of us as psychology-minded people to absorb his ideas, because he basically said that clinical judgment is not as helpful as a statistical algorithm. Long story there. He wrote a whole book on the topic, talking about when we're predicting an outcome of interest, we have to gather information about the causal factors and the predictors that lead to that outcome, and then apply a consistent statistical algorithm to predict that best, rather than using clinical judgment on a case-by-case basis. And IO has kind of taken that as the gospel truth to some degree at least, and that's why we have industry data analytics now that is so strong. But he wasn't afraid to tackle difficult ideas, this gentleman. And he wrote about, in this article specifically, why socioeconomic status, when we're talking about people who have challenges with schizophrenia and other mental challenges that affect their daily or affect their daily lives, we cannot treat SES, that is socioeconomic status, as a nuisance variable in those studies, which is what a lot of people were doing at the time in the 70s. They were saying, well, we got to control for SES always, because that's a nuisance variable. We want to make sure that we can see what our focal variables are doing. And he said, look, SES is probably not a nuisance variable. There are many other different models that are also consistent with the results that you're seeing. And he gave some examples here, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can get rid of this part. So we can see here. So same variables, and I should have said up at the top here actually, I could have said same patterns of B weights with multiple theories behind it. So instead of SES being a nuisance variable, he talks about lower class students have less money to spend, and hence they join fewer activity groups, and they suffer more isolation, and isolation helps precipitate schizophrenia. So in this case, SES is actually the cause of both social isolation. It could be a mediation where SES causes more isolation, which in turn causes the schizophrenia to appear. Lower class students, a second, I guess, possibility. Lower class students are perceived by peers as lower class, hence snobbishly rejected from activity groups, and hence suffer more isolation. So in this case, it's not SES that's the driver. It's being perceived as such, and then being excluded. And then more isolation may lead to mental health challenges. A third option, lower class students tend to acquire less competent social skills and then are rejected by their peers, and then that leads to more mental health challenges. And finally, lower class children tend to have less skillful child rearing practices, less quality parenting, hence they have less self-concept, and then those they develop defense mechanisms, etc., and raise the odds of subsequent schizophrenia. So these are just 4 alternative models where SES has a front and center role rather than a nuisance variable. And imagining that that is the case, as per my explanation on the prior slide, it's really going to impact how we do those stat analyses, what we assume is the DV versus the predictors, and it will also impact what we recommend to practitioners for for mitigating against the challenges that are associated with mental health. So I want to illustrate one final point using Spector and Brannick's example. And they talked about this idea that in the literature we see some consistency in the relationship between gender and job satisfaction. Specifically, women seem to be happier on the job than men. And we could go down the black hole of trying to figure out why that is. Like if women are just, biologically more predisposed to be happier in life and therefore they're just happier on the job. We could go there. Or we could think about alternative models that are also consistent with these findings. And this one below, the authors point out, is consistent with that. Specifically, that job satisfaction leads to leaving the job or lack thereof. So there's this negative association between job satisfaction and leaving, such that the more highly satisfied, the less likely to leave. But that relationship holds for women and not necessarily for men. So men will stay on the job that they don't like for a lot longer than women. And we can speculate as to the reasons for that. But the point is that if we have a more simplistic, like one-to-one correspondence, we see gender and job satisfaction being correlated, gender predicts job satisfaction, we make all these causal attributions, or there's something more complex going on and it's really a moderation like this. And they talk about this idea that it's important to, think through our theories, make sure that we're not using simplistic explanations for more complex phenomena that are actually going on. Again, all for the purpose of serving people well and doing, making good decisions for our clients. Now, they also talk about, I need to mention briefly, the idea of demographic variables as proxies. And demographic variables are relatively easy to collect, like age, gender, race, ethnicity, income level, things like that. But it's important to think through, are there more proximal variables that we could collect that are better indicators rather than more distal things. So gender is okay, but gender is very complex and there's a lot of within variability. So is there a way to collect a variable that is more closely related to the relationships you want to study than gender? And sometimes it isn't possible. But if we presume that the expectations for women are a certain way than they are for men, right? Maybe we should measure that, gender expectations, instead of simply gender or something like that. The other example I thought about is age. Now, let's say we're studying the relationship between age and willingness to mentor, and we find that as a person gets older, they're more likely to choose to be a mentor. Now, it's not really age that's probably doing that. It's maybe stage of life that happens to be correlated with age. Maybe it has to do with Erickson's theory where as we get older, we want to leave a legacy. And his theory has problems because I think it's very white male centric. But it could be part of the explanation that when we age, we tend to think about leaving a legacy, giving back more than when we're younger and we're just trying to make it. It could be skills and experience that we have more time because we're less, I don't know, there's just one theory, that we're less worried about keeping up and developing new skills as we're later career. And so we are more willing to invest in people at that point because we're not constantly learning new skills. So that all depends on your theory and you're closest to your particular study, your second year projects, your dissertations, whatever the case may be. And so you can think through some of the deeper explanations that go beyond just the surface of gender, age, and those kinds of basic demographics.